Hey, Harold Allman here from LinguaXDeo.com. If you're trying to figure out what language you want to learn and you're just having a difficult time choosing your language, you need to think about why you're learning the language. What are your goals if you're going to learn a new language? By the way, if you haven't subscribed already, please click on that button below and subscribe to the channel. So let's talk about the things you should consider when you're learning a language, or what things you want to consider when you're choosing a language. So when I started learning my first language, it was French, and I kind of had a head start because my mother was from Quebec, and she spoke French to me when I was a young boy, up until I was 2 or 3, and then she just stopped. So that's why I'm a native English speaker, not a native French speaker, because everybody around me was speaking English, right? So anyways, as I was growing up, my uncle recommended that I start studying French because, you know, that would put me ahead, because I grew up in Canada, and Canada was or is a bilingual country with the majority of the people speaking English and a large minority of people who speak French. So he thought I should study French. Well, that sounded good in theory, but what I found out years later was that if you're doing business in Canada, or you have a job in Canada, it's not really required that you know French, unless, of course, you're living in Quebec and you're maybe working for, you know, Hydro. They do the electrical, and everybody else around you is speaking French. But when I was working in Montreal for a software development country, all of the people there could speak French fluently. And so when they talked to me, of course, they talked in English. And you're thinking, what? It's like, yeah, they were talking to me in English because they were bilingual. They knew English. And they knew I wasn't that fantastic at speaking French. And even though I wanted to learn French, they would always switch to English when they started talking to me. And they were even switching the whole meeting from French to English when I was sitting in the meeting, which was kind of ridiculous. So that's just how things worked out with French. So I was told, oh, you know, you should study French because it's going to be good for your career. Well, it turns out what it was really good for was talking to my relatives. I have cousins in Quebec, and they speak French. That's their native language, and I also have aunts and uncles there. Some of them have passed away, but it was really useful to be able to speak French to those relatives, especially the older ones, because their grasp of English wasn't very good. So the younger people, the cousins, they got some training in English when they went to school. But the older relatives, the aunts and the uncles, they never received any education in English. So it was nice that I could talk to them in French, their native language, and they could understand what I was saying. So that's how I ended up improving my French, because obviously I knew a bit of it that was taught to me by my mother. And oh, by the way, the people who tell you that the people in Quebec, that they're not speaking real French, that's not true. What happened was, a couple hundred years ago, a lot of immigrants came in from France, and there was a particular French dialect spoken in France. And what happened was that dialect evolved or died out, I don't know which, and then the dialect that was in Quebec, it evolved into what it is now. And I really like that dialect that's spoken in Quebec. It's easier for me to understand because when I was very young, that's the language that, or the dialect that my mother was speaking. Now, the second language that I picked up much later on was Latin. And so why did I choose Latin. I was also looking at Spanish, I was looking at German, I was looking at Chinese and also Arabic, and I ended up picking Latin. Well, I thought, I'm going to learn the Latin language because I wanted to understand those phrases that people were using, like per se, quid pro quo, and all of these other bits of Latin that you'll hear people using. And the politicians like to try and fool you with terms like the omnibus spending bill. Basically means it's a catch-all, spend all your taxpayers' money bill. So they're just using a fancy word to hide the fact that they're spending a lot of money on everything. Omnibus covers everything. So that's originally why I started learning Latin, and why I continue to learn quite a bit of Latin. Well, here's how it turned out, though. So I understood what those words meant, and what I found really interesting was that, unbeknownst to me, because I'm a native English speaker, Latin was all over the place. I didn't even know it. It was in all kinds of words, and because I knew English, I just couldn't see it. It's kind of like if you're in the forest, you can't see the forest. What can you see? You can see trees. If you're in the Milky Way galaxy, can you picture how it sees? It's really, really difficult. And that's one of the things astronomers are working on, is trying to visualize how the Milky Way looks, because you're inside of it. You can see galaxies that are billions of light years away, but the one you're in, it's hard to see because you're in it. So if you're in the English language, it's hard to see the Latin words that are embedded in English. For instance, if you're in a building, there's probably a sign that says exit. It just so happens that comes from the Latin language. And Latin has exit, it's verb, and it has exitus, which means it's a noun. It's the exit, which corresponds to exit also in English. But in English, exit is also a verb, as in let's exit the building, right? So what happened is, as I picked up the Latin, is I started seeing all of these Latin roots inside of words. And it was really interesting. And it was also useful because sometimes people would use obscure English words. I don't know why, but here's a for instance. So the media loves to attack Trump, okay? So some writer in some magazine or web article, I think it was probably on the web, said of Trump that he didn't like his pueresque behavior. Now, if you didn't know Latin, you probably wouldn't know what that word meant. But puer, or poor, depending on how you pronounce it, in Latin means boy. So he's basically saying that Trump is acting like a boy. So he's assigning a pejorative, a negative term to Donald Trump. So the fact that I learned Latin and that I knew some Latin helped me understand that word. When you're picking your language, decide on why you want to learn that language. Is it to talk to relatives? Is it for a business purpose? Like if you speak Arabic or you speak Chinese, you're going to want to pick up English, obviously, because that's just the lingua franca. It's used all over the world, and it's the language that a lot of business people speak. Now, I did have a look at Chinese, and I rejected that just because it was so darn difficult to learn that language. I needed to learn possibly simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese characters. There's also pinyin, so you got 3 different character sets to learn. You've also got tones inside of the language, which they use tones a bit in English. When you're asking a question, you might say, "Did you eat yet?" So you see how the tone went up at the end of the sentence to indicate that it's a question mark in English. Well, if you know Chinese or you know about all of the tones inside of it. If you don't know Chinese, they've got 4 tones, plus there's kind of like a Chinese speaker described it as a dot. So as you pick up these foreign languages, there's all kinds of interesting things you'll learn. But for me, Chinese was just so complicated, I decided not to do it. I was also looking at Spanish, German, and at one point even Arabic. And keep in mind that there's different difficulties in these language levels. So how much time do you want to put into studying a language? Like Arabic's about the same level as Latin. German and French are one level above English approximately. So again, if you haven't subscribed, please click on that subscribe button. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.